Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the books I've read this week, and as you can kind of tell, as it will become more apparent as we talk, still very much sort of doing my in December kind of reading. So quite a few little indie books in here, which has been really great fun to sit and read really. Anyway, let's get on with talking about these wonderful books. Obviously, weekly reads is going to become a little bit more complicated given that they're normally on Sundays, and the next couple of Sundays are going to be Christmas and New Year's. So I'll work something out. But it may well be that the weekly ones stop for a little bit, and there'll be some other bits and bobs around anyway. But anyway, on to the books. So first things first, I read a few books from Tilted Axis Press, who are wonderful and who I've been slowly picking up books from across the year and been intending to read more of. And it's sort of dangerous in some ways for me because they are sort of numbered. And so there is a real thing of like, oh, well, you know, I've read 25, but not 26 and 27. You know, so I've got a few of them here. But let's talk about them in numerical order, because why not? So first up, Violent Phenomena, which is a set of essays by translators about the act of translation, and I found this really interesting in many ways. Firstly, it quite a lot of the essays talk a lot about the kind of power imbalances inherent within things like translation. So the fact that sometimes the idea of putting something into this into English for an imagined English speaking audience can feel quite bogus, because actually what is an English speaking audience, what defines them, what's special about them, it's all a very nebulous, weird concept. And so I think this set of essays really explores a lot of that, and particularly how some languages, when they're translated, things are sort of lost, but there's again this assumption that an English reader wouldn't understand certain things. And it reminds me a lot of an interview I heard with Tiang a good few years ago, where he was speaking about how, for example, a dish like laksa is widely known to an audience sort of near sort of Malaysia, Singapore, kind of around that area. But actually, for a Western audience might not necessarily be as known. So often laksa will be accompanied by a little asterisk saying, oh, it's this kind of thing. And he was sort of told to take that out of his work at one point. And actually he said, well, no, like, why is it that there's a perceived assumption that, a word like, a foodstuff like a croissant is assumed to be known for everybody, just because the majority, well, a lot of the English speaking world are fairly familiar with it. But, it's all a bit bizarre. And I think this book really drills down into some of those conversations around what do we translate, what do we not translate, what are the imbalances inherent in translation, in terms of the power imbalances for what that says about each culture and what have you. What is there something about the types of work that are often allowed to be translated versus others, and so things like that. So really interesting, and Tilted Axis really are one of those presses who are just kind of going a bit above and beyond with publishing not only great work in translation, but also really thoughtful pieces like this as well. Next up, we have So Distant From My Life by Monique Ilboudo and translated by Yarri Kamara. And this book is really interesting in quite a few ways. So it focuses, it's written by an author from Burkina Faso, and it focuses a lot on a sort of unnamed country, and the kind of this sort of weird tension between sort of people living their lives and this sort of bureaucratic kind of machine around them, and particularly when what that then looks like when you've got, for example, NGOs involved in the country and you've got various other things involved. And so we've kind of got these people who are really at this very strange crossroads of basically, I think it feels in some ways like a bit of an inversion for how these stories are normally told, right? Typically, like, stories in the past would have been very much about, an uncivilized people is suddenly exposed to all this support and what have you from the outside, and then their lives change and it's all happy clappy. And I think it's really interesting to see books like this, Ben Okri's Famished Road, a few other books really fight back in this really intelligent, funny, and sort of piercing way of, okay, actually, what does it look like when people are sort of like, what is this NGO doing? Like, why are they here? And these sort of little things that come up. So, for example, a lot of what comes up in this book is sort of around conversations around homosexuality, and particularly, you know, there's a gay character who is not particularly well received at first from some of the characters, and I think at first this book looks like it's going to set you up on that discussion of like, oh, and you know, they became more enlightened about this thing because of outsiders. No, actually quite the opposite. A lot of that drive came from within the country and within the sort of society, and actually some parts of NGO life kind of complicated matters of this. So a really, really interesting book, and yeah, just I had a lot of fun with this. Next up, a collection of poems, Unexpected Vanilla, translated by Hyemi and written originally by Soje. And what I thought was really interesting about this is it's a set of poems that really deals with a lot of sensuality, and there's a lot around the human body and nature and various things like that. So it's very sensuous in so many ways. I didn't always get on with this, I have to admit. I sometimes struggled with some of the poems, but I think overall just the language is so sumptuous and beautiful. But I think, yeah, you know, a lot of the times it's sort of taking images of nature and often inverting and sort of playing around with them in quite clever ways. So for example, you know, you've got this idea that people, you know, you sort of get these things about people's bodies being like these things of flesh and flowers or whatever, typically, right? And then this book sort of inverts it by some of that flesh being this idea of being quite rotten, but also there's this sort of dew or whatever of the flower that is also on their body. You know, it sort of plays around with a lot of those images, and it's quite clever and quite sensuous for it as well. But yeah, like I said, didn't always necessarily work for me, but there was a lot where I thought this was just a very, very beautiful book, and I think I'm really glad still that I read it. Keeping on the theme of some indie books, I read Aftermath by Preti Taneja, and this is just a bit of a gut punch of a book in many, many ways. It's so essentially the core idea of it is Preti Taneja herself ran creative writing workshops in a prison. I was sort of part of sort of working around prisons, and particularly working with people who you know, giving people an opportunity to really be able to express their emotions and really, you know, foster that love of reading and writing. And one of the people who she taught ended up being a man who actually went and committed an act of violence, sort of killing 2 people in London, sort of considered to be sort of a terrorist attack and many other things. And so she is sort of reflecting in a very raw and real way, this is very soon after the incident, on everything that happened. And it's a really interesting book in many ways, because it not only deals a bit with her personal response and reaction to this, but also the wider sort of state apparatus and how this maybe happened. So she talks a lot about, for example, the Prevent agenda, which was a sort of government anti-terrorism strategy, which I have many thoughts about. And this book also sort of critiques in quite a strong way, because so much of that policy seemed to be around the idea that there are some groups who are more innately sort of to be looked out for, and you know, there were young kids being sort of not necessarily taken away by social services, but that led to social services stepping in because the child said something, like misspoke, and it was taken, because it was a young Muslim child, it was taken as being a sign that there was terrorist activity going on at home, when actually the kid had just missaid the word bottle and it sounded a bit like bomb or whatever. I think cucumber was the word, actually. And so this book kind of delves into a lot of what was the political situation of almost how do you build a terrorist, or how do you build somebody who could be viewed as that by the state. And so she talks a lot about state violence, about racism and inequality, and how all of those things create an environment in which somebody might be quite critical of the state, but also might not necessarily get the mental health support they need, and so therefore may be caught in this weird place. And she talks a lot about how a lot of people going to prison get maybe worse while they're in prison, because actually they don't have the support they need. Maybe they were taken to prison before they'd actually committed anything that was particularly bad, and they then sort of have more of an antagonistic view of the state. So really interesting discussions going on in this book, and it's told in this very lyrical kind of patchwork, broken up kind of way, which at times was really hard to get into. But I did also find there were lots of times where I really appreciated how she sort of, these were sort of fragments, and it had to be that way. It couldn't be just a screed being angry about one thing, or it couldn't just be, woe is me, I taught this man and now look what happened. I think it needed to be a bit of a combination of both, and I think that's kind of what works so well for me about this book, is it almost intentionally sort of sits in weird places between genres, because it has to, because this is such a thorny, complicated area. And so I just thought it was a really profound and beautiful book, and very powerful for the conversation it's a big part of as well. Next up, I read Morbid Obsessions by Frankie, Miren and Alison Rumfitt, and this is published by Cypher Press, another indie. And this is just a very sort of slim, slight book that I think does, again, quite a lot in terms of having quite difficult conversations. So the whole book is sort of premised around the idea of conversations around sex work, and also trans exclusion within sort of feminist narratives or what have you. I've done a really bad job of describing what the book's about there, but you'll see when I sort of start talking about it. So Alison Rumfitt, a trans woman, and Frankie, Miren, a cis woman but who is a sex worker, both sort of share their sort of sides of the coin in terms of talking about their experiences. And a big part of what comes up in the conversation is that how often a group that will exclude one of those groups, so who might be sort of quite transphobic, might also have often views that are also against sex workers, and how there's a sort of joint narrative, particularly as so many trans people and trans women especially end up in sex work. And so there's this sort of, or are kind of overrepresented in sex work rather, I should say. And so this book starts with a story each from Frankie, Miren and Alison Rumfitt, sort of talking about their various parts. There's sort of short little segments discussing a specific area of something that they've noticed. Then there is a sort of an interview between the two of them, where they're just, just conversation between the two of them talking about those things. And then at the end, there is a narrative from a trans sex worker, and that kind of goes into a bit more detail as well. So a really fascinating book, and again, really vital in terms of the conversation. I think what I really appreciated about it was just that it's sort of no holds barred. It doesn't try to go for like these sort of big, super lofty conversations above everybody's head. It's really quite a kind of grounded, intimate discussion often about fears that both of them have. Frankie, Miren talks about not wanting to be in sex work for much longer, and her narrative in that is really interesting to hear her kind of perspective of like, here's what I want to do next, and I'm a little bit nervous about the future. And actually that's a narrative we don't often get to hear too much. So really interesting, really interesting book. And last but not least, I read In by Will McPhail, a beautiful graphic novel that I devoured and just absolutely adored. The whole idea of this is that our main character, Nick, is unable to form proper connections with people. So he sort of floats a bit through life. He realizes he's having lots of non-conversations. So his mum is over helping him paint and sort of do up part of the house. And he sort of is just having banal conversation, very much sort of small talk with her. And he realizes that he meets other people and he does the same sort of routines and what have you, and it isn't really having these deep, intimate conversations. And he meets a woman at a cafe, or at a bar originally, and then they sort of hang out a bit more. And he sort of starts to realize he's sort of starting to build connections, but also that he's not very good at this yet, that he's still very much just trying to work out how to do that. And this book, I just think, was really quite profound in terms of making a really strong case, essentially, for empathy and intimacy and vulnerability. Without spoiling anything, some changes happen in Will's life, in Nick's life, that make him think a little bit more about intimacy and how he's connecting. And actually when he does, it's really quite profound for him. And I'll try and find the exact page for this, but there are some really beautiful moments, because when he suddenly connects, the art style completely changes. So typically our art style is very much like this, very bare bones, sort of black and white. Then when he starts to connect, we get these moments of him on these giant voyages with sort of wide-eye wonder and kind of colour and things changing. And I just found this really profoundly moving as a book. I sat there and devoured it and absolutely loved it. I just think this is such a beautiful case for sort of vulnerability and empathy and care and connection, which, particularly given the last sort of 2.5-3 years, feels like a particularly profound thing. And this book is also, I mean, I say that it all sounds like it's quite grim and drab. It's incredibly funny. Very early on, he is going around these sort of hipster cafes, and they're all sort of like, you know, he sort of jokes about sort of they're very sort of Timothy Chalamet, and they're very, you know, like they only sell sort of very specific coffee that was like where the bean was eaten by an animal, and then that animal was eaten by another animal, and it was eaten by another animal, and eaten by another animal, and then what was pooed out was the coffee bean, and it's this really profound, beautiful thing, and it's so wonderfully skewering of that without being cliched. I think, you know, it can be quite low-hanging fruit to criticize hipster coffee shops, and actually I think this book is a really funny way of not only critiquing that, but also we sort of see that part of his critique of that is a lack of ability to communicate or to kind of connect. He doesn't fully know how to work within that framework almost, and then he makes these beautiful connections, and his life just radically grows and expands. And also artistically, this is just really fun. And he does do this thing with faces where everybody has these slightly like over big eyes. Don't know if you can see there properly, and so as a result everyone always looks a little bit like overly shocked, which is really just really fun to read actually, and to sort of see. And I just, yeah, graphic novels can be so great, and this is just such a wonderful example of them. Yeah. So anyway, those are the books I've read this week. Yeah, I hope everything's going really well with you. We're almost at Christmas, which is wild. And I will speak to you soon. I'm very much in kind of end of year lists mode, so there will be a few videos coming up of best fiction, best non-fiction, hopefully some best LGBT books as well, once I work out how to do that, because I realised most of my top books of the year are also LGBT, so we'll see. But either way, take care, have a wonderful holiday, and speak to you soon.